Hi, welcome to session two of the ninth topic of the semester titled The Counterculture Revolution and the Civil Rights Movement. Now, we're about to begin session two, and in this session, we're going to continue discussing the counterculture revolution, something we did in the first session, looking at the general introduction of the counterculture revolution in terms of what that counterculture revolution implied. It was a rejection of American cultural values and ideas by the generation of the 50s and 60s, particularly that generation, called the baby boomers generation, rejected the core values of American culture, such as materialism, um, rationalism, social status, and consumerism. Those were, again, the core values that American culture represented up to that time. And the baby boomer generation was not satisfied with those values, with those ideas about life, that the world was material, and that in order to understand it, the only thing we had to do was to develop our rational minds and use a scientific approach to solve the problems of the world, and that was going to be enough, pretty much, to create a happy existence in this life. And also, the notion that human beings are here in this world to improve ourselves economically, to climb the social and economic ladder, and because the higher that we go upward, that was going to actually um, determine our level of happiness. This is something, again, that the baby boomer generation rejected. And also the idea of consumerism, that the way human beings are happy is through the consumption of goods and services. Again, pretty much seeking pleasure, the pleasure that material objects give us. What material objects? Well, hosts a wide array of different consumer goods. Again, that's what Americans believed. That was, again, the source of happiness, that buying certain products, certain goods or certain services was going to actually enhance our pleasure, thereby giving us happiness. Again, all of those issues the baby boomer generation rejected, and uh, they're going to be on a quest to find the meaning of existence beyond the world of matter, something that in their time, in the 50s and 60s, the baby boomer generation are convinced that there is a higher reality beyond the veil of matter, if you will, because there were scientists like Einstein. We discussed, for example, Albert Einstein writing about the theory of relativity, um, who was suggesting that, well, the world is not really material. The universe, this creation that we experience on a day to day basis, is not really material, because matter comes from energy, and energy is non material. It's just light, it's frozen light, if you will, that are just bundles of particles of light that are vibrating and fluctuating very rapidly. And those are not things per se. Those are not bricks, or those are not physical things we can actually grasp. Those are just flashes of electricity, again, that are dancing in a specific fashion, that appear to us to be real, to be objects, but again, it's just light itself. So again, Einstein pretty much came in to shatter the notion of materialism. And of course, the other scientist we discussed at the end of session one was Carl Jung, the psychologist, who was also proposing that human beings are endowed with consciousness. It's a non-material stuff, if you will, that is the most real part of us. What actually is the most real part of us is consciousness. That is the faculty to be aware, to take notice, to witness the activities of the physical body and the activities of the mind. That is our consciousness, and that's also non-material. This is something that goes beyond matter, because it cannot be grasped, it cannot be studied, it cannot be confined to an object, but is there. This is something that we can sense, as soon as we pay attention to it, but it's not located anywhere in the body itself. Again, those ideas are going to be very important for the baby boomers, because they're going to now be on a quest to find the meaning of existence. And this is, again, where we're supposed to now see in this second session. Again, looking at our slide here now, we're now going to go into the existentialist movement to look at what the baby boomers are about to embark upon in the 50s and 60s, in terms of looking for the meaning of existence itself, because they were not satisfied with the explanations that their society provided to them, that, well, the meaning of existence is that we're living in a material world and matter is all there is to it, so we need to be happy materially, and happiness comes from material things. This generation was not satisfied with that explanation, and they're going to be on a quest to find answers, to find the meaning of human existence in other cultures, in other religions, in other paths outside of the mainstream American culture. And this gave rise to what is called the Existentialist Movement in the United States. The Existentialist Movement was at the core of the counterculture revolution of the 50s and 60s. That is to say, as the baby boomers rejected American culture, they're now embracing, if you will, aspects of other cultures and other religions outside of, let's say, Christianity. Christianity was considered to be the predominant faith in the United States. And the baby boomers are going to be now on a quest to find the meaning of existence in other cultures and in other religions. And so the existentialist movement was in itself like the rebellious, if you will, aspect of this counterculture revolution. The baby boomers are rebelling against American culture, and the way they're doing that is by embracing other cultures as they're trying to find the meaning of human existence. That is to say, and it is understood that in the 50s and 60s, the baby boomers were doing this not just because they consider themselves rebels, or simply because they were fed up with their parents trying to, their parents trying to teach them or guide them to become successful economically and get a good job and, move to the suburbs so they can actually form a family there. And that was it. It was not just that they were rebelling against their parents and their culture. It's just that the baby boomers were going through an existential crisis themselves. In other words, they felt lost. In other words, they felt anguish. They felt anxiety on a day-to-day basis because they felt something missing in their lives. In other words, they felt a great part of the answers, that the most important, again, answers for understanding human existence was missing from them. They felt that this material world and everything the material world offered was not really satisfying their inner peace, for example, their feeling of love, their feeling of compassion, for example, that those feelings were not nurtured by the world they inhabited. They just felt that they needed to have something higher to see, to grasp, to aspire to feel at peace, to feel loved, to feel, again, that they were cared for by this universe. This universe couldn't just be possibly, just a machine that functioned mechanically and that was about it. Again, that concept, is so uh, detached from human emotion, that we just live in a physical universe that function on its own, that doesn't care for us, for example. That creates a feeling of loneliness. Many people feel very lonely under that assumption. If you believe that the universe is just this physical machine that moves by itself, that functions automatically by laws, you know, so, what then is the answer to, for example, things like death and suffering? Why do human beings suffer? Why there's death, why there is calamities and catastrophes in the world? How can we explain that? you know are we just physical creatures in this world that are moving around, having random experiences and trying to survive without something higher that is actually taking care of us, watching over us, and actually making sure that we develop successfully in this world and as fully as possible to develop our full potentials, for example? If there's something like that, or is it just like what science tells us, is that no, nature is just a lump of matter, and the universe, again, is a gigantic machine that is operating under laws we call natural laws, and that's pretty much about it. So those ideas again left the baby boomers very, very isolated. When we talk about isolated, is that people felt lonely. The baby boomers felt that there was something missing, something lacking, in the world, something higher, like a higher order, a higher being, perhaps, that was in charge of the universe, that cared for what human beings were going through, that there was existence even after death, that death itself was not the end of existence, that human beings are in this earth, live for a while, but after a while, the part of us that is eternal, whether you want to call it the soul or the spirit or consciousness, that part of us actually goes beyond the body and moves forward, if you will, to another realm, to continue the journey of existence. That is to say, that existence itself is eternal, that never ends. So again, this is a generation that was very preoccupied with those issues. What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of human existence? Do we exist even after death? Where do we go after we die? If there's a place that we're going to actually go and rest, for example, or are we going to come back, like reincarnation, for example? Are we going to reincarnate into the world to continue our journey of experience, of human experience in this world? What are the answers to that? Okay, what is the purpose of being alive? Okay, why are we here? We are here, but what is the reason? What is the ultimate purpose of everything? So again, those are very, very important questions. Those are existential questions. What we mean about existential questions is that those questions are about existence. What is existence? What is the existence of a human being? Is it just the physical body? Is it just the mind? Or do we exist beyond the body and the mind? Okay, do we have a soul? Where does the soul comes from? Where was my soul before coming into this world, for example, before being born? And where is the soul or consciousness going to go after death? Again, those are very, very important questions that the baby boomers took, as the central questions of life, that were not necessarily answered by their families, by their parents, by their scientists and teachers, by their society. Again, the answers they received were not satisfying, that is to say, because they were very materialistic, that is to say. So again, this led to the existentialist movement, in the United States by the baby boomers in the 50s and 60s, because now this generation is going to be now looking for answers. What are the answers to the questions about human existence? And one of the philosophers that was key in launching the existentialist movement in the United States, he is like the father, if you will, of the existentialist movement, was Aldous Huxley. Okay, he was a British, actually, thinker, philosopher, writer, and his books were widely read both in Europe and in the United States and worldwide. By the way, worldwide. He wrote extensively, but one of the most influential books he wrote that are credited to have initiated the existentialist movement in the United States was called The Doors of Perception. The Doors of Perception. And this was a book that became a bestseller in the United States. It was like the Bible, if you will, of the baby boomers. Particularly once we get into the 1960s, Aldous Huxley was read by virtually every member of the existentialist movement. And what this book indicates is that what Huxley was suggesting here is that human beings have the potential to experience reality beyond the veil of materialism. In other words, that we can actually perceive non-material things. Okay, we can actually expand our view of the universe. We can see reality as it is. But what prevents us from doing that is the way we were educated, the way we were raised by our parents, by our society, education system, the way our teachers instructed us, for example, when we were very young, about the world around us. That we, as human beings, come into the world and receive information that close our minds to the possibility of seeing reality as it is. Non-materially, that is to say, because remember, materialism is just like a veil, is just a dance of light, it's an illusion, in other words. But human beings have the capacity to actually see beyond matter. But why we don't see that is because our minds were closed off, if you will, to see beyond matter, to see non-material reality. That is to say, whether you want to call it spirits or the soul or or energy itself, that all of that is real, but we don't perceive it like that because our minds were conditioned, were programmed by our society to only perceive a very narrow portion of the universe. So we perceive the universe from the lens of a fly, in other words, because we were told that what the material objects that surround us, this is the only thing that is real, don't look for anything else. And we began to pretty much close the doors of our minds. Our minds is like a doorway to the universe, if you will. Our senses, our five senses, and our mind is like a window, is like a door to the universe. But when we were very young, we began to close those doors. We began to pretty much close the doors of our mind and the doors of our senses, our five senses. We have five senses, to the possibility of perceiving the universe as it is. And so therefore we started perceiving the universe according to how our teachers, according to how our parents were looking at it. Okay, they passed on their view of the world unto us by telling us what the world was. And we started forming ideas and beliefs, based on their own interpretation of reality. And we started looking at the world through their eyes. We look at the world based upon how the people that raised us, was looking at the world. Okay, and so this goes on from generation to generation, from generation to generation. So what Aldous Huxley was suggesting is that in order to actually see the universe as it is, we need to open the doors of perception. Open the doors, open the mind, in other words, to unlock the mind from all the limited beliefs that we inherited from our parents and teachers and elders, in order to start expanding the mind. That the mind needs to be opened up. We need to be expanding our minds in order to see the world as it is, okay, beyond the veil of matter, that is to say, okay, the doors of perception. That is important to expand the mind. And of course, what Aldous Huxley was suggesting is that there are certain practices, certain techniques that ancient civilizations left to us. There's ancient civilizations, for example, in India. There are systems, spiritual disciplines that people embark upon in order to open the doors of perception, to awaken the mind, if you will. So the mind can be freed from all the limited beliefs about the world, so it can experience the spirit, for example, to seek enlightenment, for example. So there are, around the world, we're not just talking about, one specific culture. I just mentioned India to be just an example. There are several civilizations that left specific practices or techniques that were designed to help the practitioner to open the mind again to a higher realm, to a higher dimension, if you will. Okay, so this is what he's actually suggesting, that people need to be actually on a search for those practices and be disciplined to be practicing those disciplines on a day-to-day basis to seek enlightenment, that is to say. Okay, so again, this particular book, The Doors of Perception, was just inspirational in many cases for this generation, because people were convinced that, well, there are methods, there are specific ways that we can actually carry out. There's specific disciplines, there's specific methods that we can actually apply in order to begin this process of finding the meaning of existence. That we're not lost. There's plenty of guidance. There's plenty of information. There's wisdom that we need to be searching for in order to actually help us understand ourselves and answer the most important questions of human existence. Like for example, the meaning of death, the meaning of suffering, what is the soul, where the soul goes after death, and so on and so forth. Okay, so again, this is a very critical point in U.S. history, because this generation is actually breaking away from the mainstream ideas of the time of American culture. They're rejecting it, and they're now on a search for higher meaning and purpose in other cultures from around the world. And initially, this baby boomer generation was searching for higher meaning and purpose in ancient foreign religions. So they're going to abandon Christianity in great numbers. Again, this is a time when anywhere between 20 to 30% of young Americans are going to abandon Christianity. Imagine, so Christianity was the dominant faith in the United States, regardless of what denomination we're talking about. It can be Catholic or Protestant. There's many Protestant denominations in the United States, but they're all Christian. But in the 50s and 60s, 20 to 30% of Americans, young Americans particularly, are going to walk away from their pastors, from their priests, from their churches, because they're not finding answers in Christianity. Not that Christianity doesn't provide them, it's just that they're not actually finding ways how to open the doors of perception, okay? How to expand the mind, how to attain enlightenment, for example. how to awaken consciousness, for example. That those kinds of practices are not carried out inside of the Christian churches in the United States. So a great many of them are going to be leading in great numbers Christian churches, and they're going to be pursuing other religions. They're going to be finding or pursuing answers, seeking answers in ancient foreign religions, for example, like in Native American shamanism. Okay, uh, Native American spirituality, in the 50s and 60s is going to become one of the most popular uh, religions, pretty much in the United States, that Americans were very attracted to. It's not just that people found Native American religion or spirituality something fancy or exotic, is that people were on a quest. Remember, people were on a quest as to, well, maybe the Native Americans can tell us something about how to open the mind. Okay, so this is what the baby boomers want. They want to open up the mind, open the doors of perception to perceive the world, in a more expanded way. So uh, there's going to be in the United States a movement in which Americans, young Americans, were going native. They were indeed going native because there were thousands of Americans visiting the Native American reservations. There's, of course, a number of Native American reservations all scattered across the United States, but particularly the reservations in the Great Plains and the reservations of the American West are going to be visited once again by thousands of Americans uh, on a year-to-year basis, because Americans wanted to find out if Native Americans had indeed, certain practices, certain disciplines, or what kind of wisdom they had regarding, for example, the opening of the human mind, for example. And one of the most popular forms of Native American religious practices that Americans found very attractive to was called shamanism. Okay, Native American shamanism. What is Native American shamanism? Well, Native American shamanism is part of Native American religions. Okay, it's not really a religion itself. Native American shamanism is actually the part of Native American spirituality that deals with healing. Okay, the shamans, the practitioners are called shamans. Okay, the shamans or shamans are the ones that are the religious and spiritual healers of society. Okay, they possess knowledge of herbs, they possess knowledge of plants and rituals that are used in order to heal sickness or various kinds of illness that are produced by spiritual forces. Okay, there are illnesses like the evil eye, the fright, for example, being frightened, for example, by a spirit or ghost, leaves a person pretty much disabled and experiencing high fevers, for example. The evil eye is the same thing, again, pretty much receiving negative energy from another person. As well, things like witchcraft and spells and sorcery, for example, love spells and all of that, those are actually, issues that cause what is called supernatural illness on a person. Those are not physical illnesses. Those are illnesses produced by energy, produced by spirits that the shaman is able to remove from a person's body by using, once again, things like plants and herbs, smudges, burning incense, and smudging the body of the patient, and of course reciting prayers, doing a specific ritual, and so on. There's specific magical formulas that are applied in the healing process. Okay, so again, shamanism has to do with healing, but also shamanism has to do with a specific practice by which the shaman, in this case, is able to open up the mind to induce what is called visions. Okay, the shaman is an expert in opening up the mind to receive visions from the spirit world. Okay, what is called vision quest, a vision quest. Okay, and, of course, the shamans, the way they do that is by withdrawing from society, uh, uh, retreating to a cave or on top of a mountain. They go to the desert, for example. They fast for many days and they ingest certain, psychedelic plants that Native Americans have used for thousands of years. And in those states of altered states of consciousness, once they're removed from society, when they're alone again in those places and they ingest those plants, they're able to open the mind again and perceive, of course, spiritual beings, entities, um, ancestor spirits that communicate to them specific messages, visions that are critical to the life of the shaman. They can receive knowledge of healing, they can receive important information about what is to come in the future, and so on and so forth. Again, that's another aspect of shamanism. It's not just the healing aspect, but it's also, again, the vision uh, component, again, the inducing visions. So, um, Native American shamanism is going to become uh, uh, known in the United States uh, thanks to the writings of an American anthropologist. Uh, his name was Carlos Castañeda. Carlos Castañeda was credited for actually making Native American shamanism known in the United States. This was, again, a topic that only a selected few, people knew about. Shamanism, scholars, for example, historians, some of them, knew about shamanism, but the larger public was totally unaware of what shamanism was. But thanks to Carlos Castañeda, uh, Americans became now more and more aware of what shamanism was. And Carlos Castañeda was an anthropologist who was very interested in shamanism and wanted to write a doctoral thesis. So he visited Mexico in the late 50s and early 60s to look for a shaman or shaman, again in Mexico, a Native American shaman. And he found one in northern Mexico, again in North Mexico. And he not only visited the shaman, but he actually lived for several years in the village of the shaman. And he became the disciple of the shaman. And according to Carlos Castañeda, his name was Don Juan. Okay, Don Juan. And so he became the disciple and he started learning about plants and herbs, and he underwent vision quest rituals. That is to say, he was trained to induce visions the way the Native Americans were, very skilled at. By means of retreating to a place and ingesting psychedelic plants and so on, having those psychedelic experiences, that is to say. And so when he came back to the United States, Carlos Castañeda wrote about his experiences in his doctoral thesis, which later he published into a book. This book was called The Teachings of Don Juan. Okay, this was Carlos Castañeda's doctoral thesis, which he did in Mexico, by the way. Again, in it, what he's actually describing is what he experienced, in those vision quests. It's not just that people were interested in the healing aspect, of course, of shamanism, is that Americans were very much interested about those vision quests that Carlos Castañeda was describing. Carlos Castañeda was describing that as he ingested those psychedelic plants, that his mind pretty much opened up to a whole new reality. A reality that was always there, but it was hidden from view because he was paying attention to something else all the time. The way we all humans are, in other words. But he started seeing, for example, nature as alive. Okay, that the earth was breathing, that the earth was an organism, that was conscious. Again, it was aware, and it was just like us, for example, just like, for example, a human being. It was actually an organism that had life, that had force, that it was actually breathing, and it has like a heartbeat and so on and so forth. Very much, again, the way you experience any other organism, any other living organism. And he started seeing everything as alive. The plants were alive, the trees were alive, and you could actually engage in communication with them, by the way, if you're open to it. And even the rocks, that appear like just a lump of matter, that they were also full of life and consciousness as well. That the clouds were also living things moving through the sky and so on and so forth. That might appear to be, something, out of the ordinary, by any scientific mind. For example, a scientist hearing this might say, well, that's too far-fetched. But again, in those altered state of consciousness, once the doors of perception opened up, what Carlos Castañeda was suggesting is that this is the way that Native American shamans perceive the world. Okay, they perceive the world pretty much alive, full of energy, full of life force, breathing, and being conscious, being aware of everything that is taking place. So again, he developed a deep connection with the world of nature. Carlos Castañeda pretty much became very fond of shamanism, and a proponent of shamanism in the United States, and he's going to be very influential in promoting shamanism in the United States, to the point that that actually inspired the baby boomers to seek similar experiences. They wanted to be just like Carlos Castañeda. They wanted to visit a Native American reservation, look for the shaman of the reservation, and become a disciple, and learn everything about that path. They wanted to open their minds. They wanted to heal themselves and being able to expand their view of life, the view of the universe, and seek the same visions. They wanted to also receive knowledge and wisdom from the higher planes and their ancestors and so on. So, it was a phenomenon, to the point that by the 1960s, many Americans were going native in the process. They were not just learning from the shamans, they were becoming natives themselves. They were adopted by the Native American tribe, and they adopted a different name. They changed their name from their American name to a Native American name, and they were going through an identity shift. Okay, they acquired a whole new identity in the process. Okay, it was, again, a phenomenon. It's something that many people were, very shocked to see. How is it that the youth, they will say, are rejecting their own culture, and they're pretty much embracing the culture of others, in other words. So not only was Native American shamanism becoming popular in the United States, there were other religions that were becoming popular because Americans were also searching elsewhere for answers. And that is that in the United States, foreign religions, particularly from the Far East, were becoming extremely popular in the United States at this time, like Hinduism and yoga, for example. Those are actually religious and spiritual systems that come from India, okay, in the Far East. Again, we're talking about India. India, again, is a civilization that is thousands of years old, more than 6,000 years old, over that, of course. India is known to be the cradle of spirituality in the world. Okay, the early religions and early forms of spiritual practices actually come from India, by the way. So Hinduism, which is actually a particular religion of India, center on a god and goddess worship. There's many gods, again, in India, and many goddesses. This is something that it will become very, very popular in the United States, because those gods in India do not represent like a god in the form that we understand a god. For example, that, well, you're worshiping something, outside of yourself. You think that, or you believe that there's a god in the sky that has this form or this name, and you're praying to. No, in India, again, each god is actually a part of us that needs to be nurtured. Okay, there's a part of us that needs to be awakened and nurtured. So that's why they have so many gods, because there's so many, again, aspects of ourselves that need to be developed. For example, there's a goddess of wisdom. Okay, in India, well, if you need wisdom in your life, by worshiping the goddess of wisdom, what you're doing is you're awakening the wisdom within yourself. That is to say, okay, the wisdom within yourself. There are gods of strength. There's the gods of knowledge. There's gods of healing, and all of that is within ourselves. And by actually paying attention to those gods and goddesses, people are actually awakening or developing those faculties within ourselves, in other words. So again, Hinduism is going to become quite popular in the United States because people felt that that was a way that they could indeed awaken, something that was dormant within themselves. For example, wisdom or visions or healing, for example. Okay, and also yoga. Yoga comes from India and is not a religion. It's very important to know that yoga is not a religion. This is a science, the science of spiritual awakening. Yoga is just a set of spiritual practices, disciplines, that enables the practitioner to awaken spiritually. That is to say, to awaken the mind for perceiving consciousness, perceiving the spirit. That is to say, okay. So yoga is, for the most part, centered on meditation practices. Okay, meditation practices. It goes beyond just simply stretching and doing postures and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that might be a preparation, if you will, for something else, but that's not yoga. Yoga is actually meditation, to quiet the mind, to empty the mind from all thoughts, if you will, in order for the mind to experience inner peace. And in that inner peace, the mind is able to see what's behind it, which is, of course, consciousness or the spirit, that is to say. So it's important to cease all mental activity. All thinking has to be stopped, not by force, not by forcing it, but by a series of disciplines that enable the practitioner to relax and to actually soothe the mind, to calm the mind, in order for the yogi, it's called the yogi, the practitioner, to actually, again, experience the soul or the spirit, that is to say. Okay, and so there's going to be a lot of yoga centers, a lot of yoga masters and teachers coming from India to the United States. There will be a great many, again, Hindu and yoga masters coming to the United States to promote Hinduism and yoga, and they found a great reception in the United States because there was a spiritual thirst in the United States for alternative ways of actually experiencing spirituality. People were not satisfied with the spirituality of the time, which was, of course, for the most part, Christianity, and people wanted to step outside of the mainstream to look for other ways. There's also Buddhism. Buddhism is also going to become very, very popular in the United States at this time. There's many paths of Buddhism, by the way. Buddhism is not necessarily a religion. It's not considered a religion. It's considered to be a philosophy, a way of life, not a religion. There are no ceremonies, there's no rituals to practice. The only thing that the Buddhists practice is, again, meditation. But in the Far East, there are different kinds of Buddhism. There's Zen Buddhism that is practiced in Japan, for example, and there's also Tibetan Buddhism that was practiced in Tibet as well. Different forms of meditation practices by the Buddhists, if you will, that are going to gain a lot of popularity in the United States in the 50s and 60s, particularly since the 1960s. And the reason for that is because once again, people wanted to learn certain techniques, certain practices to experience enlightenment. Of course, Buddha was considered to be a spiritual teacher who attained enlightenment uh, 5 centuries before the birth of Christ. Again, we're talking about 5 centuries before Christ. Again, in the Far East, in India, there was again an individual by the name of well, he was known as the Buddha. By the way, that was not his name. His name was Siddhartha, but uh, so he taught specific techniques, specific meditation techniques to enable the practitioner to attain enlightenment. Okay, and again, those techniques were introduced in the United States at this time, and they became very popular to the point that uh, many Americans were not just practicing, for example, Hinduism or yoga or Buddhism, but in many cases they were at the same time that they were practicing that, they were also adopting the identity of those cultures, changing their names from their American name to, let's say, an Indian name. You know, they were adopting the name of a god, an Indian god, for example, or they were adopting a Buddhist name. And in many cases, they were becoming monks, you know, of Hinduism. They were becoming Buddhist monks. And they started pretty much uh, living in their spiritual schools. We're going to see the opening of spiritual schools like yoga centers. There were spiritual retreats, for example, religious temples in which Americans were there providing service to the teacher, the main master who came from India, for example. There was an Indian master. They're called gurus. Again, a guru is a spiritual master, somebody that came from India to open up a school in the United States, and they were Americans, again, that were living in those religious temples or spiritual schools or yoga centers that were actually monks. They had become monks, and they were really providing assistance and service, you know, to the master. And they had adopted a whole new identity. They changed their names, etc. You know, some of them shaved their heads and started dressing in robes that were identical to the robes worn by masters or monks in the Far East. So again, this was considered to be a phenomenon in the United States. That how is it, you know, that Americans are, you know, going now to the extreme of, you know, transforming themselves to become, you know, like an Indian yogi or a Buddhist monk. You know, this is so far removed from us, you know, but again, this was gaining a lot of popularity at this time. Now, besides Americans searching for answers in foreign and ancient religions, it is also important to note that Americans were also in search of the perfect or the ideal community as well. Okay, they wanted to find, you know, a new world. They wanted to create a new world as well. Okay, so there was a substantial number of baby boomers that were trying to create a new society, the ideal society based on community living. That is to say, okay, for them, living inside of a community in which people will be supportive of each other, in which people were not going to engage in competition and only seek their own individual self-interest, but rather people will live together to collaborate and cooperate with one another to sustain the society, to sustain the community. That was very meaningful for them. They believed that this was the way that human beings were supposed to live in this earth, to live in groups, to live in communities, people helping one another, and people will find some form of peace, inner peace and happiness in that kind of environment as well. So we're going to see that this was part also of this counterculture revolution. Again, it's called, again, In Search of Community Living and Utopian Societies. A utopian society is the ideal, perfect society. That's what utopian means, okay? A utopian society is the ideal, perfect society. That is to say, based on community living. So this search for community living led to what is called the hippie movement in the United States. It was called also the flower power generation. The flower power generation, those that were labeled flower power were also at the same time labeled the hippies. In other words, there was also the hippies of the 1960s. Those were individuals that rejected, American society, particularly the way people live in the large industrial cities of the United States. The hippies, even though many of them lived in the cities, they were not really happy living in those cities because they felt that people were always on a rat race, so to speak, always rushing, going to work, and competing with one another, and that the life in the city was very chaotic. Okay, and that also people were so competitive, okay, inside of the city because there was only a limited amount of jobs, limited amount of positions, limited amount of opportunities in schools, for example, limited amount of resources. That because those opportunities were limited, therefore people were very competitive and they were competing to the point that they engage in something cutthroat competition, that people have become ruthless with one another because they were trying to get ahead in the city by getting the best paying job or getting into the right school and so on. And in many cases, they will trample upon, their neighbor in order to get ahead in life. And that had become the norm in the United States, particularly in the American cities. So again, the hippies are rejecting all of that, altogether. And instead, they're dropping out of school. Many of them actually were in college, and they're going to actually drop out of school, being dissatisfied with the education system of the time. The education system was just simply trying to train students to be competitive, for example, in society, and to be consumers at the same time. And so they will drop out. They will drop out of college, but they also drop out of society, because what many of them did was to withdraw from the city and now move to the outskirts of the city. And in many cases, they moved, to the wilderness. They will buy land, let's say, in some remote place in the mountains and so on, and in order to start forming a community, that is to say. So we're going to see the formation of communities in the United States, which the hippies called communes. Okay, what is a commune? Well, a commune in the 1960s was a community that was independent, okay, economically and politically fully independent, that the members of that community actually were engaged in decision making, that they decided how people were going to conduct their business, their activities, their way of life, that everything, the important decision as to how the community was to function, that the members of that community were going to decide everything about it without any outside influence, that is to say, okay, and that they were going to produce their own food. That's what economically independent is, that they were not going to depend from resources from the outside, like food or money, etc. Again, that was considered to be, like the ideal community for them. Okay, a commune, that is to say, politically independent, making their own decisions as to how they're going to live, and also economically independent to pretty much be self-sustained, that they were going to sustain themselves, in other words. So inside of this commune, okay, which was like a social experiment, You know, the hippies were trying to create like a new type of society, if you will, based on cooperation and collaboration. Well, what actually happened is that the hippies living there, the so-called hippies, by the way, uh, also practice something called peace and love. That look, you know, in this society, there's not going to be struggles or tension or competition, but rather the ideal is for the members of the community to experience on a constant basis peace and love. That this is the basis of any successful society, past and present, that societies that lived in peace and people shared or felt love for their neighbor, that those were societies that were solid and that they were to survive the test of time. That is to say, peace and love. They promoted the idea that this is what humanity needed. In other words, we need to create a new society. The ideal society is going to be based on peace and love. But what this translated to eventually was that inside of those communities, uh, feeling love or expressing love, for your neighbor meant that there were not going to be any restrictions whatsoever in terms of, for example, of how people were supposed to love one another. Okay, this was called free love. In other words, the love. We're not going to have, for example, a marriage, a traditional marriage inside of the commune in which there's, again, a couple, they get married, they form a family, and they're supposed to be simply committed to one another, loyal to each other, and so on. That they rejected that notion. They rejected the traditional uh, marriage system of American society. They rebelled against it. Okay, they totally rebel against it because they said this traditional form of marriage causes a lot of problems like jealousy, insecurity, and fights. But instead, what we're going to do is pretty much marry the group. Okay, practice something called group marriage. You go into that, commune, and you engage in what's called free love. So you engage pretty much, in demonstrating your affection, your love, to any member of the community that you want. It's called free love, by the way. So they practice a form of group marriage. That is to say that you were married to the entire group in order to start breaking down the jealousies and the insecurities and all of that, the drama and so on and so forth. That was their idea, by the way. So group marriage became the kind of practice. There were no ceremonies, by the way, in which you were actually marrying the entire group, but you were married into the group because of the way that social intimacy or sexual intimacy was conducted there. Again, it was called free love, by the way. Okay, this is again a practice that was not new in the United States. Communities, based on group marriage and free love, have existed prior to this time in the United States. When you look, for example, back in U.S. history, particularly in the 1840s. We're talking about the 19th century, 1840s and 1850s. There was actually a religious community called the Oneidas that practiced something very similar to what the hippies are practicing here in the 1960s. The Oneidas, we're talking about the 1840s and 50s in New York. In the state of New York, there was a religious community called the Oneidas that actually wanted to create a new community. They wanted to create a new society as well by the members coming together and engage in something called group marriage as well. You married into the group. There was no traditional marriage inside of the community because you were married into the entire group, of course, without any restrictions whatsoever. Uh, Also, people were not allowed to own property because, the entire community was owned by everybody as well. Again, it was more like a group kind of deal. Again, you belong to the group and you have the same rights, the same entitlements, and the same partners, again, of the group as well. Again, so this was a sort of like repetition of something that already happened back in the 19th century. But now the only difference is that during the hippie era of the 60s is that there were not just one community, there were hundreds of those communities scattered across the country that were practicing something quite similar as the Oneidas were practicing back in their, in the 19th century. Okay, so as the saying goes, history repeats itself. That's what historians actually, we say that, but not exactly alike. History repeats itself, but not exactly alike. Okay, so there's variants. Now, of course, there's another aspect of the counterculture revolution that needs to be assessed as well in terms of how people were trying to find meaning and purpose in this world. So we already discussed two very important aspects. One was searching for answers in foreign religions like Native American shamanism, yoga, Hinduism, Buddhism, and the like, and also in trying to create the ideal community, like the hippies trying to create communes based on free love and so on. Okay, but there's a third aspect in the counterculture revolution in which certain groups, particularly African Americans and Mexican Americans, were trying to find meaning and purpose by reconnecting with their ethnic roots. So this is quite different because in this case, what certain ethnic groups in the United States were trying to do is really reconnect with their ancestors, with their own ethnic past, with their own ethnic ancestors, to see what kind of counsel, what kind of advice, what kind of wisdom they left to them to guide them into how they were supposed to live in this world. Okay, so for example, there were a substantial number of African Americans in the United States that rejected American culture and even Christianity, and instead embraced the culture of Africa, okay, and also the religion of Islam, okay. Again, this is a counterculture revolution. Remember, people are revolting against the culture and they're embracing other cultures and religions. So the African Americans, in this case, were turning to Africa, to their own ethnic roots. They said, well, our ancestors were, in Africa in the distant past, and we would like to know what they had to say about how we're supposed to live in this world. Okay, if we're not satisfied to live according to the values of American culture of materialism, for example, and social status, consumerism, well, what our ancestors had to say about how to live in this world. Okay, and so in the 1960s, what we're going to see is a new movement among African Americans. It was ethnic, but it was also a religious movement in which there was a certain pride, if you will, among certain leaders of the African American community. There were some of them were actually intellectuals, writers, highly educated, by the way. Others were religious leaders who were turning to Africa again for answers, and they created again what is called a Black Power movement. That what they said is that African Americans needed to be empowered, and the way to be empowered to take back their own lives and to make important contributions in the world and to live with more wisdom. They said, well, we need to actually look to Africa for answers, because Africa, is a vast continent that our ancestors inhabited for thousands of years, and they left to us a lot of knowledge that is not available to us at this time, because, of course, in the distant past, centuries ago, many millions of Africans were actually taken to the Americans as slaves, and as the African slaves came to America, they lost their connection with their African roots. The African slaves living in various parts of the Americas were no longer in contact with their uh, brothers and sisters, so to speak, again, in Africa, to be in touch with the traditions, with the culture, with the religions, with the wisdom. That was practiced in Africa. So there was a certain rupture, a connection was lost, if you will, in the process of the slave trade, so to speak. Again, that started around the 1500s. We're talking about the 1500s and the 16, 1700s. Okay, so at this time in the United States, what was going on is that American scholars in various universities in the United States were actually making trips to Africa. American intellectuals, American professors, and scholars that specialized on African culture were actually making trips to Africa to study African societies and cultures and religions. They were coming back and they were publishing books. There was an explosion of articles and books published about Africa in the 50s and 60s, which led to the so-called, again, Black Power movement in the United States, because now African Americans are reading about Africa, something that was not very accessible in the past. People wrote about Africa in the past, but not in the way that they were writing in the 50s and 60s. So now African Americans, particularly those that were highly educated, intellectuals, and so on, are reading the works of those American professors about Africa. And there was a sort of rediscovery, so to speak. African Americans were really rediscovering their roots. They were now coming across new information to them that was lost a long time ago. And now they felt immensely attracted and very proud about their African roots. And they said, this is what we need to do. We need to reconnect back with our African ancestors. We need to bring back the knowledge of our forefathers. We need to live according to how our ancestors lived. With the kind of knowledge, with the kind of wisdom as to how humans need to treat each other, how humans need to treat the earth. Why is it that certain rituals are important, and so on and so forth? That kind of living, if you will. Okay, and so the Black Power movement really was a movement that was trying to get the African American population to feel very proud about their African heritage, because in this Black Power movement, the leaders of this movement were upholding African culture and heritage as superior. They were saying, look, not only superior, but also beautiful. What they were actually saying is that, look, uh, being African American is actually beautiful. We are actually beautiful, human beings. There's incredible beauty in the continent of Africa. The cultures, there are hundreds of different cultures scattered across the continent, each having different languages and traditions and so on. And so therefore, again, they were trying to reprogram, in the minds of the African American population, the idea that, look, the concept of beauty, you have to actually, revise the concept of beauty, because, what we consider beautiful is what we were taught, by our own society. And we were never taught about Africa. But if you study Africa, you will realize that it's immensely beautiful. So again, African peoples are very beautiful. We have to train ourselves to see it that way. But also they were saying that they were also superior. Now, in what ways were they saying superior? Well, during this time, say the 50s and 60s, there were now new scientific studies coming out, indicating that the origin of the human species in this planet goes back to Africa. That was the cradle of humanity. In other words, that the earliest records of human beings walking in this earth are in Africa. That is the original human being. In other words, what they were actually saying here is not that they're superior to other people. in the way that we tend to hear, or understand the word superior. But what they're actually saying is that, look, uh, African peoples are the oldest, in other words. We're the oldest human beings. We go back since the beginning of time. That is to say, this is the original human being. So the original human being was African. That is to say, we're talking about, 6 million years or more. That the earliest records that scholars have found of bones and so on of the first humans, the original human being, is in Africa. So millions of years ago, the original human being was actually African, and after that, some of those human beings began to step out of Africa and they began to move all over the world. Some of them went up north to Europe, others to the Middle East, others to Asia, others to the Americas, and so on. And after millions of years, human beings began to mutate and acquire different physical characteristics, acquiring different skin colors, different, kinds of, eye colors, and so on and so forth, based on diet, based on climate, based on the natural environment that we were exposed to. So we became very different. That is to say, there's a lot of diversity. But what they were actually saying is that we all come from Africa. In other words, we all share the same ancestors. And the original ancestors were actually African. This is the original human being. This is, again, what they were proposing, the Black Power movement, again, that people needed to be very proud about Africa because it was beautiful, and also because that was the homeland, again, of humanity, if you will, okay? The most ancestral peoples of the world, that is to say, okay? So this was a movement to boost the ethnic, pride of the African American community. And of course, as I mentioned, this movement was also about religion. It was not only about ethnicity, but it was also religious, in that a portion of the African Americans that were part of this movement rejected Christianity and embraced instead the religion of Islam. Okay, we're going to see a new Islamic community composed of African Americans in the United States that was called the Nation of Islam, founded by Elijah Muhammad again. Other co-founders were Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali as well. Okay, so why we're going to see this is because, once again, this is a cultural revolution. Okay, people are rebelling against their own culture. So the mainstream religion in the United States at this time was Christianity. And why the leaders of the Nation of Islam are going to reject Christianity is because what they said was that it's not just that the religion was bad or anything. They did not really criticize Christianity at all. What they were just doing was an act of protest or rebellion against the leaders of the Christian churches in the United States, which were, of course, in charge of the white society. In other words, that Christianity had been used, if you will, to oppress non-white peoples, in other words. And so in order to walk away from this white society, this white-dominated society, they said, well, we're going to reject their religion of Christianity because it keeps people segregated. African Americans were still segregated at this time in the United States. And so as an act of protest, what they said, we're just going to walk away, from Christianity, and we're going to actually go on our way, and we're going to actually embrace a different faith. It was more like an act of protest, more than anything else, abandoning Christianity, that is to say, okay, which was the religion of the slave owners of the 19th century and the religion of the segregationists, again, of the day. Okay, another group that is also going to reconnect with their ethnic roots are the Mexican Americans. Okay, Mexican Americans are also a substantial number of them. We're not talking about all of them. Are going to reject also American culture and turn to their forefathers, their ancestors back in ancient Mexico. Okay, they turn to ancient Mexico, particularly the Aztecs. Okay, the ancient Aztecs, which are considered, again, the forerunners of the nation of Mexico. This is a Native American civilization that got established in the 1200s. And this is a civilization that actually existed in the United States, in the American Southwest, again, in places like Colorado and New Mexico. The Aztecs came from the United States, by the way, and they migrated into central Mexico, and they built an empire, in central Mexico that lasted until the coming of the Spaniards. And the Spaniards pretty much, ended the Aztec Empire in 1521. So Mexican Americans, intellectuals, particularly in the United States, were now looking at the Aztecs for inspiration. What the Aztecs have to say about, how we're supposed to live, because information was coming out about the Aztecs through academic studies that the Aztecs were very advanced, peoples. They had system of mathematics, astronomy, the movement of the planets, the sun, the moon, and so on. They have very precise calendars. They were, magnificent artists and engineers, building pyramids that were aligned with the stars and the moon and the sun and so on. So those were not just, again, ordinary peoples. They were very intelligent, if you will. Okay. And so Mexican Americans are turning their attention, their eyes are set again on the Aztecs because they want to find out what the Aztecs have to say about how people should live. But what's important here to note is that the Mexican Americans are finding out, that the Aztecs actually came from the United States, particularly in a region where most of Mexican Americans live. When we talk about the bulk of the Mexican American population in the United States, it's in the American Southwest. The American Southwest constitutes Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, but also constitute Texas and California. But the Aztecs are supposed to be, people that actually came from a place called Aztlan. The land of the Aztecs was in the U.S. Okay, so the Mexican American population, as soon as they found out that, wait a minute, so the Aztecs, the forerunners of Mexico, actually came from a region that now the ancestors of the Aztecs, the Mexican Americans, are considered to be the heirs or somewhat connected to the Aztecs. They now live in the United States. They were mesmerized by that fact that they said, well, the Aztecs, never really left this place called Aztlan because we're still here. We are the ancestors. We are the descendants of the Aztecs. We live in Aztlan, in other words. But now Aztlan is part of another country called the United States. So this served to boost the ethnic pride of the Mexican American population, feeling very, very proud that their own ancestors, the Aztecs, came from a place which they still inhabit at this time, that is to say. So this led to really a movement that is going to be called the Chicano movement. Okay, the Chicano movement. It's stated here in the outline. The Chicano movement, because what the Mexican Americans are proposing, the leaders of the Chicano movement, is that, look, the Aztecs, once upon a time, once they arrived to central Mexico in the 1200s, they were known as the Mexicas. Okay, the Mexicas. And of course, this is, again, the name from which Mexico, the name Mexico comes from, Mexica. Again, the Aztecs were the Mexicas, that is to say. Okay, they were known as the Mexicas. And so, as people realized that the Aztecs were the same as the Mexicas, Mexican Americans began to now call themselves Chicanos, because they said, well, we are the descendants, the heirs of the Mexicas, so we are Chicanos, So what they were actually emphasizing is their Mexican identity, that they come from Mexico, but particularly they come from the Aztecs, because Mexico, again, is a mix of Spaniard and indigenous peoples, of course. But what the Chicanos in the United States are saying is that we call ourselves Chicanos which are the descendants of the Mexicas, because we're emphasizing the fact that we acknowledge the Aztecs to be our forefathers, more so than the Spaniards. In other words, they're choosing, in this case, an indigenous inheritance rather than a Spanish or Hispanic inheritance. They're proud about having in their blood, in other words, the DNA, if you will, of the Aztecs, the intelligence, the prowess, the wisdom, again, of the Aztecs. Okay, and they were trying to bring into the United States, again, everything Aztec. That's what the Chicano movement is, again. That the Chicano movement was a revival of Aztec identity and Aztec art, Aztec foods, Aztec religious practices, Aztec culture in the United States. You know, you go to California, there were murals about the Aztec emperors there. You know, there's the palaces and the pyramids were painted there. Again, people were, again, the leaders, the followers of the Chicano movement, again, were, you know, very convinced that they were Aztecs themselves and that they were living in Aztlan. In other words, that this was, you know, the home of the Aztecs. This was called Aztlan, but we just happened to be living in a different political, you know, country called the United States. But still, this region, once upon a time, was the homeland of our ancestors, and they felt that the Aztecs were coming back. That Aztec civilization was being reborn, that they were bringing it back in every possible way. Again, so this led, again, to the Chicano movement, and this is how Mexican Americans were, you know, finding comfort. They were finding some form of counsel as to how people needed to live, you know, in this world. So they said, what we're actually going to do is live just like the Aztecs. In other words, just like the members of the Black Power movement were trying to bring back Africa into the United States, in many respects, the Mexican Americans wanted to bring back the Aztecs, so to speak, again, to find more meaning and purpose, again, in this world. You know, it was really trying to boost people's pride. Now, this is the end, again, of session 2. When we come back, we're going to go into part 2. In session 3, we're going to initiate part 2, which is going to deal now with the civil rights movement. This is a totally different movement that was going on simultaneously during the 1950s and 60s. It was more political than cultural. It was a movement led by minorities, such as women, Mexican Americans, and African Americans, as they were trying to reform the political institutions of the United States to create a more democratic society based on equality. Again, based on equality. This is something that we're going to see in great depth. Again, in session 3, we're going to spend the entire session talking about the civil rights movement. This is all I have for you. This is the end of session 2, and I'll see you then in session 3 when we come back. Thank you.